Welcome to Collateral Banter. My friend Rachel is on the show today. Thank you for coming on. I'm really happy that you're here because I wanted to talk to you about agriculture and food systems. I know everybody around, in the political world today is talking about Trump and impeachment, but we're going to put that aside. All right. I'm sure.
I'm not ready to talk about that.
Nobody's ready to talk about that. But I'm sure I'll be doing something on that eventually. But Rachel, so you and I have had a conversation before, and I wanted to bring up the topic of organic food. And a lot of people who live in urban areas, in Boston and LA, always go out and buy organic when they're at the supermarket. But they also want organic everywhere else they're purchasing food. You and I had this conversation that we need to think more deeply about what organic means. And so I wanted to know if you can talk a little bit about organic at a farmer's market versus organic at a supermarket.
Yeah, absolutely. Organic is such a hot topic. It's like when we talk about food, there's that line. People are either thinking just food in general or organic food. It's like this special category. And so people kind of have their own definition of what that means. And I don't really know where they get that definition necessarily, but I actually worked at a farmer's market, and you get these questions every day, like, is your food organic? And the farmer's market the farm I was working for actually wasn't organic, but we use quote unquote organic practices. So there's this kind of perception out there in the world that if you're certified organic, you don't spray your food. And that's what people are all up in arms about, is like this fear about what is on my food. Where does that food come from? And those two things are totally separate ideas. Like what's on my food versus where it comes from are completely different concepts. But I think people kind of get these ideas all mixed up. Like, is this GMO, genetically modified?
Yeah.
Does it have pesticides on it? And then this word organic kind of feels like a safe word to them in that sense.
Right. And so, but do they think everything has to be organic and are willing to pay the price for it? Like, what if something is not labeled organic? Is it still safe? Because I felt like you explained to me that organic doesn't need to be labeled organic for it to be safe.
Yeah.
And you talked about like the practices at the farm that you've worked at, and they're not necessarily going to be labeled organic, but it's still safe practices.
Yeah.
Like tell me how do you know that? Like, how can you tell a consumer that? How do you educate a consumer? Educate me. Like, what would you say if I'm like, I don't want to buy your strawberries unless it says organic?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I was saying, I worked at this farm that was not certified organic, but they used something called integrated pest management, which is an alternative practice. So what it always comes down to in the farmer's market is really knowing how your farmer is growing their food, which is one of the benefits of like purchasing things at a farmer's market, is you can actually talk to the farmer or someone who knows about the vegetables.
Exactly.
So integrated pest management means that the farmer is using spraying as a complete last resort. So they're doing everything in their power to monitor the produce, use pests of prey to attack these negative pests that might eat at or destroy your strawberries, for example. And then if at all there's some sort of like infestation on one part of the crop, they'll potentially spray that area, but then not sell it to the customers for a long time until it's kind of like I don't know the word for that, but until it's quote unquote safe.
Safe, right.
So I would have customers come up and ask me that at the farmer's market, and I would give them that exact spiel. Yeah. And some people were like, oh, absolutely, that's great. Right. I'll still buy this. But other people just have this wall up. The second you say, no, it's not organic, it's like their ears completely turn off. So there's this problem that comes out of this where people are willing to pay a price for produce as long as it's certified organic. But not everyone can afford to buy produce that is organic.
Right.
And not every farm can afford to pay for a certification of organic practices.
Right.
And so a lot of farmers are doing a lot of work out there to ensure that their food is safe for consumers to eat.
Right. Especially at a farmer's market.
Exactly. Especially at a farmer's market, they care about the food that they're selling to you. They're not just some like big farm out in the middle of nowhere sending their produce across the country. You know what I mean?
Right. No, absolutely.
And so there's a lot of problems that arise with this misinformation around organic. One being that organic produce is so expensive. So what about people that can't afford to pay for that produce? Are they just screwed? They can't eat anything that's like not safe for them? You know what I mean? So I always wonder what those consumers are thinking about the quality of produce that other people are buying.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
No, I mean, look, that's another topic I was also going to bring up when we're discussing organic, because it tends to have a vibe of these urban young professionals who are buying food and they're targeting specifically organic. But there's a big economic question about that, and you've been bringing that up, and I think that's really important, because when I go to the supermarket, I see organic strawberries at like $7.99, $8.99, right? And it's really expensive. And non-organic is $3.99 or $4.99. But the reason why I go and shop organic at a supermarket, which I don't do nearly as much as I used to, but the reason is because I don't know who produced that. I mean, oftentimes it's produced out in California, right? And so you don't have that connection with, I don't know their practices. I mean, this is, you know, it's like Driscoll. It's some big, large corporation. And we can talk about that because that has a role in it. And it's, sure, it's, you know, providing strawberries in December or January when there probably shouldn't be around. But at $8.99 for strawberries, it's being produced in a way that I'm not sure, you know, how they're actually producing it.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, that's what something like a farmer's market brings to a community, is that you actually get this relationship, actually get to talk to people, and actually get educated. You know, about food and about like what organic means and things like that. And I think that you can't have that relation to the supermarket. You grab your thing and you go. Absolutely. And you have all of your food in one place and then you leave, right? And so I don't know how my food's produced. So then at those places, I almost rather feel like organic is safer. To me, it really depends on where am I shopping if I'm really going to decide to be organic. But it's because of you that I came to that conclusion, because this all started because I wanted organic strawberries until you then explained to me that. But I was receptive to being like, oh, okay, I never knew that about the food system. Yeah. That really I should think about, how is this actual food being produced? Who's producing it? Who is the farm? What are their practices? And all those questions.
Exactly. There's so much more to the food system than whether or not there's pesticides on the food that you're eating.
Right.
And the other piece of misinformation here is that people think that if you're certified organic, you have absolutely no spraying going on your farm. And actually, that's not true. Organic farms do spray. They just use an organic chemical. So it's still chemical. So
right.
I want to take a moment to just say, like, I'm not shitting on organic farms. You know what I mean? Like, I do think the organic certification is a helpful process to hold people accountable to their practices, to communicate with the consumer, etc. But I think that there has to be a lot more knowledge imparted on people than just the certification written on the front of a box in a grocery store. So that comes back to, like, how are we accessing our food? What does food mean to us? Because we go into these grocery stores and we just see all of this food available, and we don't really, and I don't know about all of us, but for the most part, we're not really making the connection. We're not really thinking about the humans out there growing the food, what they're doing, whether or not they care. You know what I mean? And how much heart and soul is going into that. We're just, or even the fact that food grows in the ground. You know what I mean? Like, there's this other problem with the younger generation kind of thinking that food comes from a grocery store.
We talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this entire, like, system that goes into getting our food on our plate, and we take so much of it for granted that we just kind of go out there and shove food down our mouths, you know what I mean? And call it a day. But there's so much to it.
Yeah, so I wanted to hit on that because this ties into healthcare. Well, I'll get back to the economics and prices because I think that's really important. But on healthcare, and we're talking about people not even realizing that they're eating food. I mean, this is a big problem in the United States, is obesity, poor healthcare, eating food that isn't actually food.
Yeah.
You know, it's connected to overeating, it's people not even paying attention. And I admit this to you, like, there was a period in my life a few years back where I was overweight, and I was realizing that I was eating food so quickly, I didn't even know what I was eating, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you're almost eating and not even thinking about, like, you're actually eating food because you were eating it so quick, I'd be done in 10 minutes or something like that. And I think that this is a really interesting connection to food because it's something people must do, most do every day, but they don't actually think about like what is the consequence of eating this food long term. And you've begun to, you read articles today, and I am not one to say like ban all food, everybody must be a vegan, or this is also connecting back to climate change. But I'm thinking about Michael Pollan's book. I forgot if it was like Food Rules, but it's one of his books where he began to teach me in a book about, look, if you're having lots of meat and a little bit of rice and a little bit of beans, why don't you flip that around? Why don't you have lots of rice and lots of beans, or, beans is probably better for you, and then just a little bit of meat on the side instead of making the dish, and actually bring in like broccoli and other foods. And it's like that sort of mentality, and it's changing up the excessive meat consumption and also excessive food consumption that we notice in the United States. And I think this touches in this sort of society where like, I don't want to cook for food. I don't want to prepare food, like, and how important food is actually to your overall health. And people do not realize that food is a consequence long-term to your health, right? It's
Absolutely.
like you do something, it's not going to hit you tomorrow or the day after.
Right.
But,
it's like smoking cigarettes or something.
right.
You know what I mean?
Actually, that's a great comparison.
Yeah, I mean, people will do it and they'll talk about the potential for cancer or, but it's so long term. And so I think you've touched on a few things here, and I think it comes back to culture at the end. You know what I mean? The end of the day, our culture is not just what's happening around us, but it's the mindsets and the values. So even the way that we talk about or conceptualize ourselves here versus what's going to happen to us in the future,
right,
impacts the choices that we make. I actually heard this once that I think it might be Japan. In Japanese, they don't actually have the future tense.
Oh, wow.
And I mean, obviously, I'm not like a Japanese language scholar, so
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
quote me on this, but it's this idea that like in their language, the way that they articulate their words actually informs the choices that they make. So they're less likely, like the cigarette they're smoking now
Right.
is the same, like who they are in this moment is the exact same version of themselves that they are in the future. And therefore that cigarette that they're smoking now is the future. Yeah.
Right,
you know what
right,
I mean?
right.
Like
I
the
do.
cancer isn't something that's going to happen to you someday.
Right.
It's already you,
Right. Oh,
So
that's interesting.
it's really interesting, right? So getting back to this idea of food, I think it comes down to this kind of mindless culture that we live in. It's kind of like we're not really aware of our relationship to our body
Yep.
or what we're taking into our body in that moment, or
Right.
really accepting the long-term consequences of how we're interacting with food and how that interaction is affecting not only us, but like the entire world around us. So it's
Right,
just
right,
this
right.
kind of like we make all of these choices, but we're not really thinking about the choices we're making.
And so I had this debate with a friend, but I love your thought on this. So I was talking to her. She has a family and kids and 2 kids. And I was talking to her about, prices of food at a supermarket, and like that, a large part of the food system is run by these big companies where they oftentimes mistreat the animals, and that you're going to buy. So you're going to pay $2.99, okay, $2.99 for chicken, okay, 1 pound, whatever, half pound of chicken or whatever it is, okay?
Yeah.
And like you don't know how it was produced, but if it was produced by one of these large companies, oftentimes they have awful conditions, awful life. They don't even stand up sometimes. And this has a consequence for you if you consume this over long run of your life, and we pay for it in healthcare. But my argument to my friend was one way to stop this, and it's not necessarily economically just, but is to have a better pricing of food in general, right? Like, why can't we subsidize something like a farmer's market through grants, through the states, or somehow get creative to actually promote sustainability of local and small farmers who, as you said, are conscious about the way they produce food,
Absolutely.
right, versus subsidizing large-scale agriculture. Now, some are going to counter and say it's because they want to live in the cities and don't want to produce food. But we know that today that's not necessarily true. You don't need to be in a rural area to produce your own food. Right? Like if you have space in an urban area, you can grow your own food, large parts of it.
Towards that, for
Yeah,
sure.
people are working towards that. And so I love your thought on, like, is it fair to somehow increase prices of food at the supermarket in order to somehow be like, you know what, that chicken we're going to have to let it free range. So it's not going to be $2.99. It's going to be $4.99 or $5.99. Because the issue is, large scale companies are trying to profit maximize. And I'm worried, like, in the future, are they going to genetically modify the chickens so they're fine just sitting there? We don't need to go down that path. But
you're bringing up a lot of points here, and it's really complex. I'm trying to think about it. The big companies are producing animals the way they're producing them for the purpose of being able to produce as much as possible for as cheap as possible.
For as cheap as possible, right.
Obviously, they want the consumer to pay as much as possible for it, but I don't think it's consumers' demand for the way this chicken is being raised that's really impacting the price. Like, I think, let's say people refuse to pay $2.50 for their chicken and started saying we're going to pay $5 for it. I think those bigger companies are still going to try to get away with as cheap of practices as possible.
Right. Okay.
You know what I mean?
Right,
so I think, again, it comes down to, how do you trust industry?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, can you trust them?
You can't.
And the more centralized and localized we can make production, the more you know about it.
Right.
That doesn't mean that everyone that's growing or raising food locally is doing it the right way
or in a sustainable way or in a just way or something like that.
Yeah. But I think back to your main point is, like, is this just? I mean, no, there's people out there that are always going to be poor for now.
Right.
So it's like we talk about all these things. We talk about, like, the well-being of the animal. We talk about knowledge. We talk about finances around food and practices of farmers. But when it really comes down to is that poverty is an issue.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's like we're talking about the food system, but you really can't talk about food without ending up talking about incomes, and economic issues.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. I mean, the big companies, how do you disrupt them? Everybody talks about Amazon disrupting a bunch of stores and things like that. How do we disrupt big agriculture? Because I think, like you're saying, they're profit maximizing. They probably willing to charge as much as possible for whatever they're producing. Like, how can we reconceptualize food production systems at the local level? Okay, so farmers market would be shopping one thing. Like, what solutions could we do? You think, like, land trust? Like, what do you think could be possible remedies to some of these?
Yeah, so trying to build up the infrastructure of local agriculture. So like the way that we invest in or divest, if that's the word, in big industry is by investing in local industry, right? And the only way to do that is to build up infrastructure.
Right.
So what that looks like at a local level is like processing centers and aggregators that are helping these local farmers sell their produce to stores around the area.
Right.
Because the farmers market is not actually the solution. There aren't enough customers.
Right.
It doesn't run year round.
Right.
There needs to be, especially in New England, like there needs to be a way to process and keep this food for the winter.
Right. So it's really about getting them into the local restaurants, the local economies, and really trying to sell them there locally. So it's like farm to table, right? A lot of people are talking about that today, and how important that is going to be for farmers is really to start getting field deal. Now, we live around here, Western Mass, there are a lot of universities around here. Even getting the universities to begin to fund and support that, I think is really important. I know UMass does that.
I'm actually working on a project with them right now to do exactly that. So it's like looking at what farmers need in this area to help them sell more of their produce to local vendors like UMass.
Yeah.
So what we kind of came across is that there's all this surplus. There's something called on-farm food loss, essentially. It's leftover food that gets left in the fields, and usually the only response to that is gleaning, which is when nonprofit food pantries and food banks come and just take that food for free and distribute it to people who need food.
Right.
And what's starting to be thought about is that this is an opportunity to help farmers get their food into the markets. So not just that it's an opportunity, but asking the question, like, why is it that farmers who are struggling are missing out on opportunities to get into markets? So it's like this two-tiered question, why is there waste, but also like how can we help increase their access to these markets? So we're kind of just thinking strategically about these exact questions that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think the answer just keeps coming down to infrastructure and then looking at the economic or like the local economy itself.
Right.
You know, so
Yeah.
looking at like how we're building our workforce, how we're helping people stay in communities and get jobs and empower themselves to be able to afford that produce. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I was talking with a friend yesterday that it's like this constant battle between like supporting local farmers, which means raising the
Prices,
cost,
right?
right? And feeding the people of the area. And it's like, how do you balance those two? And I still don't really know the answer.
Yeah.
I just think it takes, like, it's called a food system, right? It takes a system. It's not about like a one fixed solution to anything. You have to look at all the parts.
I think a part of it is going to be that like people need a level of income. They need a minimum level of financial support. You know, a large part of people get it through work, but there are other ways that people try to, you know, survive working, whatever they can do, you know, to survive. And it's difficult, especially when wages are so low. It's like the government is almost subsidizing corporations by having to give money to people, right? Because it's like that's where we are, because salaries and wages are ultimately a cost on their books, right? Like they got to pay increased benefits, higher wages. That's all cost onto the business's back. So they're going to push up prices and make cuts in their workforce or something like that, right? I mean, we know how the system works.
Yeah.
I think largely, you know, large part. And sure, there are some exceptions that do some great work, but I think it's really difficult. You know, I mean, I think what helps in this area of Western Mass is that we have these sort of anchor industries, universities, hospitals, these not kind of knowledge centers that help to kind of sustain this local economy. So because these places need professors, need staff, have students, right? So you kind of have this base of consumers and support. But another area I think that people, or that farmers and people who look at this industry are going to have to examine is, how do you educate people around food systems, right? Like, how do you teach people that this matters and that this entire podcast is useless because they could just drive oftentimes their Prius and go to Whole Foods and go spend money over there? Because I think a part of this is also consumers demanding that the food systems be produced differently and not just through Whole Foods, which is now part of Amazon and making Jeff Bezos a lot of money, which I have to admit, in case I know people listen to all around the country here in Western Mass, they love shopping there. I have gone there until I got myself educated around these systems. I had gone there and purchased a small number of things, but now I can find those alternatives at the River Valley Co-op, for example, right? You can find co-ops that exist that are producing food more locally, more sustainably, better for a lot of reasons. And yes, it is a price, but you know what? It's not that much more.
No, I agree.
It can be done. It does require sacrifice. You know, if people don't want to cut in other areas, some people can't afford it. And that is true. But that to me is an economic issue largely happening in the country as well. But, you know, if we're talking about food and what's going inside your body, in my view from that is that has to be priority number one.
Absolutely.
Because if your body is not well, how can anything else function, right? Like people take that for granted because they're like, what's wrong? I'm able to eat. But and I don't want to go on this point again, but I'll at least throw it out there. So I have family who lives abroad, and they often come to the United States and visit people, and they often tell me they've never seen so many people who are like obese and overweight in like a young age. And I don't know, they're just telling me that, like that's something that they notice. And they're like, oh, the United States is going to pay a huge price for this down the road. And it's like, I think that's why we talk about healthcare all the time.
Yeah.
That's why 16% of the GDP or whatever it is spent on healthcare in the country. And it's like, yeah, a large part of it is spent at the end of your life. But like, imagine how much savings we could do if people had a different concept about food. And I will do a shout out to one politician on the show. What's her name? Marianne Williamson, I think is her name. Williamson.
I think so.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. So she's kind of this, I don't know, I've heard mixed things about her, but she did bring up an interesting point in the debate, and that's why I liked her, is because she was willing to bring up we never talk about why Americans are so unhealthy. Like why are we paying so much more, right? And so you can talk about any of those topics, but also, which I give you so many to do, but I also just thought of this, and I just wanted to throw it out there. In the United States, we oftentimes don't think about geography and the layout and build out of cities and how important that is to health and human being and transportation. I brought this up because I foresee a lot of areas in this country that are rural, they are going to suffer. They already have through the opiate crisis. But imagine in 10, 20 years, are areas where it takes you an hour and a half to get to Walmart, because oftentimes that is the only store available to people. And if you can't get there by walking or public transportation, you're going to have to buy a car and drive there. Okay. And if you do a calculation over 10, 20, 30 years of you driving your car back and forth versus somebody living in an urban center, we are creating two societies in this large gap, right? Because somebody in the city who owns no car must get everywhere by public transportation. And I have a friend currently living in New York, and she's experiencing it right now, where she's like, I'm walking everywhere, and it's a lot of exercise. And you know, for her, it's good ways. But we don't conceptually talk about that or think about that too. Not enough, in my opinion, right, about that issue. So on top of everything else that I was dumping on you, what do you think about geography or anything like that? So
what I want to talk about here is really like the culture that we live in, the world that we live in. It really comes down to being about like how you've been talking about education as one piece of this. We're talking about politics as another piece of it.
But then like also consumers, you know, I was talking about like what is the consumer role? You know, you can talk about that as well. I don't know what of the interests you the most.
I want to talk about like why people make the choices that they make and the world that we live in. Like how have we gotten to this point where we're eating mindlessly, it's affecting our health to the point that we know we're in a system where we can't even afford the health care provided to us. So why would we want to get ourselves sick? And we're living in a world where we can't really, like we don't really know how to make our own food or grow our own food. It just kind of feels like we're fucking ourselves in the long run because we're just living in this endless consumerism and this endless like action without any thought of like the recourse or the outcome of what's going to happen to us in the long term. And I think that's a product of the world we live in, and not necessarily the whole world, because like you said, like your family from other places, and I've been to Europe and seen these people skinny doing the right thing, like walking around and buying from their local baker or whatever, you know. I think that we're living in a world that's built to be this way. You know what I mean? Like I really think that in order to be healthy, it would need to come from all angles. Do you know what I mean? It would need to come from the political side of things. There would need to be policies that change. There needs to be education. People need to know about the long-term effects of the choices that they're making, not just on their health, but on the world at large. Like, look at what's happening right now. We're in this climate crisis. We're literally destroying the world around us. And people are acting like, A, it's not happening, and B, even if it does happen, it's not that big of a deal. But when you're talking about like not wanting to grow your own food, not wanting to cook your food, it's like, guess what? You may not have a choice sometime soon. You know what I mean? Like we might actually be moving towards a time period where we're not really capable of sustaining this world of like industrial production. And I'm saying may to be light about it, but in reality, I mean, like
it's likely, it's possible.
It's very possible. Like the data out there that people are talking about, like I go to an institution like UMass Amherst, people are talking about this and it's not like speculation anymore. It's almost like, oops, we're too late. And the only thing we can do at this point is kind of accept the reality. So what I have been learning is like there's all these issues, and the only thing that's going to make change happen is radical change. Do you know what I mean? It's not a matter of like, can we educate people? Can people access it? It's kind of like we have to make changes culturally. Like we have to wake up, and it just doesn't matter at this point if that's not my thing. I don't really care about the environment. Oh, that's not my thing. I don't really like, I'm not a foodie. It's like, I just think we're getting to a point where it's not really a choice anymore. Or it won't be a choice anymore. And if you don't know how to grow your own food, you're going to be screwed. And I'm not trying to scare people. I'm starting to get to that place in my mind as well. Where I'm like, we're making, like in the end, we're making choices for ourselves. But I also think we're in this world where there's a reason that we don't feel like we know how to make these choices. And I know it sounds like a little bit conspiracy theory. No.
We don't have enough of that on this show.
Like that's where I'm at.
It's not conspiracy theory. Look, from my perspective, and you can add, and we can talk about this because it requires a change in culture. But we got to this culture through a process, right? Like mass consumption. I mean, let's go through the process. We were an agriculture society, right? And then we industrialized for 100+ years, okay? Starting in the 19th century, going until at least the 1950s and 60s, okay? And then everybody starts writing, and you know this from literature and reading all this, right? We go through a deindustrialization process. That's what they called it, right? Deindustrialized service economy is what we became, right? And I'm looking at this from an economic perspective, right? Think about this as a culture production, right? Because it's like part of deindustrialization and service economy is mass consumption, right? Like it's a part of that. It's like, how do we produce the most amount of things that consumers want? And we just keep producing without giving it a thought, right? Nobody's necessarily like, well, how much of this do we really need? It's based off of, we can make everybody buy this product, right? Like that's the goal.
But that's the thing. Like we're the consumers. Like we're not necessarily giving it a thought, but someone is making this choice very intentionally because they can make money off of it.
So who are they? Who are the ones making the thought and doing it intentionally? And they know people aren't thinking about it.
Right.
And I don't think it's about people being dumb or smart. In my opinion, it's not.
No, it's about them providing something that we want and need and making life just easy enough for us that we don't really notice what's going on. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
Like, of course I want my food as fast as possible. Given, food's like a basic human need. So it's like, if someone's going to provide it to me and it's going to be ready and it's going to be warm, I'm going to eat it. You know what I mean? I'm not going to say like, please don't sell this to me. I'd love to go toil in the field and work my ass off.
Sure.
So similarly, like, I don't know, like they're selling us cars, they're selling us all of these things, and we want them. We want TVs. We want to just sit on our couches and be comfy and happy. Yeah. But in the end, it's eroding the world that we live in. It's destroying our own health. But
and I also think that if I can just slip in here, because I do talk about the technology economy a lot, and you see that a lot of it is funded through targeted marketing, right? And it's why the data economy is so obsessed about knowing everything about us at all times, where we are, who we hang out with, who our friends are, who are doing all these things. Oh, so we can sell you ads, so that way it's free for you, right? And if it's free for you, and then they get to monetize essentially just the things you do in life. They monetize your life, right? And that's where we are, and that's where we're headed. And for a long period of time, I had no idea how they were making money, right? These things were worth tens of billions of dollars, and we were like, wait a minute, but you don't pay for Google, right? But they got to search your emails and then try to figure out what targeted ads, depending on your age and income, and based on all these variables. And what I'm saying right now hopefully doesn't sound like conspiracy theory to people, because it is how this data economy, it's the way it's working, right?
Right. And no company is one company. They own other companies that are, the food industry is only owned by like 5 or 10 companies. The entire industry. So it's like, it's not just some mom and pop shop. Like you're not just giving money to Google. Who's Google? They own all of these things. They're making money off of knowing our information.
Knowing our information and monetizing that. And I think like the way to attack this industry, to disrupt this industry, is like you're saying, it requires sort of a cultural change. And I just don't know how to ignite that cultural change without trying to, reach out to as many people as possible. Maybe doing this podcast changes 1 or 2 people, right? But like cultural change is slow oftentimes, you know, especially in the world we exist today, because a part of this is our data-driven economy that I feel people are overwhelmed by the number of information. Like everybody feels like they can know everything because of the internet, right? So they almost don't have to know anything.
I know.
It's like a contradiction in itself. But imagine if one day the internet just stopped working. Right? And then it's like, where are you left at? That because you're not thinking about these from a sort of a critical way to like, how do you empower these local farmers, pay them more, but make sure that people who are suffering economically, which is an increasingly larger and larger part of the country and all throughout the society, people are struggling to make $20,000, $30,000 a year, right? A large percentage of Americans. It's like, how do you get that cultural change to begin to force them to say, you know what? It starts with something so basic as food. Yeah. I mean, the only other thing I think more basic than food is water. Absolutely. Because without that, I mean, you're sort of dead in like 3 days, right? But like, you can go a while without food, but okay, large percentage of us need sustainable quality food all the time. And it's so interesting that sort of like these urban cultures that I see in America oftentimes are people like you were talking about, foodies, and all they want to do is like, go to these kind of upscale restaurants, but them themselves are not thinking critically as well of like, oh, could I grow this food? Could I do these things?
I think it goes back to misinformation. Like what we were talking about at the farmer's market is like, if there's some label on it, if it's associated with some, again, it goes back to like monetizing thing. It's like, if it's advertised as sustainable and good for the earth, people are just going to buy into that. You know what I mean?
Right.
I did this project last year, actually, where I was investigating like the difference between the sustainability of certain milk products and then like nut-based milk products. Yeah. Because I was really frustrated with this idea that these people are going out there trying to make different decisions as consumers, like you said, like going to Whole Foods, buying this food. Right. And it's like, you want to be doing the right thing, but even that is like a marketing scam at this point. Right. Suddenly, this industrialized, consumer-based society is like, ooh, we found people with some sort of passion for doing good in the world. We're going to monetize on that as well, you know? Right. The other thing I want to talk about really quick is like how do we make that change? Like you were talking about what does it take? And we feel so overwhelmed in this culture of information. And I think you're right. Like we do kind of feel like, who am I? I'm just like a drop in the bucket. I'm in this massive globe with all these people, and me doing something different isn't actually going to change the world. But I think that culture is this really interesting thing. And as people, we're not actually as individual as we think we are. And when you study science and you study bacteria, it's like everything is actually working together and shifting together. Like when you see schools of fish underwater, it's like one or two start to shift and they all move together. And it's the same with birds in the sky. And I'm not a scientist on that level, but I read something about evolution and how it works in terms of like, how do animals on one island evolve and then never leave that island, but that evolution actually spreads? And it's this idea that we're actually these little like microcosms of groups, and our neural networks are connected across the globe. You know what I mean? And I know this, like maybe we could be looking this up, but it's this idea that like that we can only make choices within the context of our community. But as we make decisions, as we learn, once it reaches a maximum capacity, it like, what is it? It's called like the critical maximum theory or something like that. It has to do with, it was studied based on like a group of monkeys, I'm pretty sure, like washing.
Critical max theory?
Something like that.
Critical mass theory.
Critical mass. Like yes, thank you. When it reaches a critical mass, suddenly everyone shifts. You know what I mean? Right. So it's this idea that, like, bringing it back to society really quick before you, like, give us the data about animals. It's this idea that we don't need to speak to the entire global population and say, hey, we all need to eat locally and do this thing. We all need to, like, shift away from consumerism. It's really just us and our friends and the people around us that need to be dedicated to what we're doing. And if we do that and other people are doing that as well in their communities, over time, the shift will happen.
Right. Yeah, they actually talk about that in Changes in Society. I'm looking at this very briefly, but they talk about when, like, I think the number was 30%. I could be wrong because I've clicked on a couple pages here, but it's called critical mass theory. It's in sociodynamics, and essentially is when a sufficient number of adopters of an innovation in a system so that the rate of adoption becomes self-sustaining and creates further growth. So you're saying it doesn't need to be adopted by like 100% of people in order to change, which kind of gives it a sense that, like, you know, each day, each week that an individual is making a choice, they could be making a different choice that could have a ripple effect down the road. It's a lot like food, right? You eat that food that isn't good for you today, tomorrow, the day after. It's not terrible, right? Like, you're not going to die from just 3 days worth of eating food. But long term, without exercise, without all these things, it could impact you down the future. And I almost think, like, looking at critical mass, it's like this has a long-term impact, but even a small change, a small ripple for it has a very powerful effect. So, you know, I mean, look, is it a political or revolutionary act to go to a local food co-op instead of a large-scale supermarket? No. But is there a way to begin to, like, hand out leaflets or promote ideas that people should spend less of their money there and spend it on local systems and local food co-ops. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that struggle right now is an uphill battle. But any change ever is always going to be a large scale battle.
Right.
And I know that these big companies are going to want to try to buy into this local food system so they can kind of replicate themselves. And I think like local food systems are going to have to somehow be like, we're not for sale. This isn't a process. This isn't a process necessarily where we're going to have to go down your corporate profit maximizing, process where we, limit costs and maximize profits. But it's like, no.
Yeah. I do want to say, like, back to your point about it's not actually a political revolutionary thing to go buy from your local co-op. Like, I do think it is. Maybe not that one specific choice, but
that's what I meant.
I know what you meant, but I just want to touch on that piece that people feel so overwhelmed. Like, just one choice at a time, or like, how am I going to make a difference in this world? Like, fuck it, I might as well not do it. But it's not just about the purchase. It's about even the critical decision that you're making to think differently and to talk to the people around you and to slowly shift your approach to the world, even your way of thinking about it, to say, like, I'm not buying it anymore. You know what I mean? Like, you can't monetize my life. This is my life, and I care about the way I'm living my life.
Right.
And I just think we're at a point where this is necessary. We don't have the option anymore.
So there's a guy who I know who runs the local farmers market, and he owns a home nearby here, and he grows quite a bit of food. And if I could tell you how much money he saves, first of all, it's not a lot of effort. You just buy fertilizer and you basically just grow the food in the springtime and the summer. And basically, he doesn't even need to go to the supermarket for a large number of things. Like, he goes to the supermarket and he purchases, who knows how many things, but it's limited. Because a large part of the vegetables, the peppers, the different things that he can grow in his own backyard. And look, maybe that is, another part of this is laziness. Just talking to you about it makes me think of all the critiques. It's like there's a huge part of the American consumer and culture is just lazy. And we pay a price for laziness, a huge price socially. Everybody does. Because if you think about also healthcare, it's like you and I pay taxes that are also, going to fund people. In ways insurance works is you and I pay into the insurance, and a person, when they get sick, they call in and need it. Right? Like, that's the way insurance works. So people's laziness and be like, well, leave me alone. I get to do whatever I want. This is freedom and I don't have to do anything like that. And it's like, no, actually you live in a society. And I think that like you're forced to do certain things, right? Yeah. Large number of people are forced in either to find a social program to sustain them or find a job, and like those are just like you're compelled into it in society. You can't just go out, live in the woods and be like, I don't want to use anything. I don't want to see any human beings ever again, and just run away from it all, right?
Yeah.
So because once you're forced into it, your decisions have consequences, and people don't realize that. Like your even small decisions have social consequences.
Yeah, I think the idea of freedom is interesting because we see freedom as this like right to self-sufficiency or to be left alone. But I think you're right. Like, as part of a society, freedom is almost the ability to rely on other people. Actually, we are free to rely on these systems. So it's like, I don't know, I'm from a family of 7 siblings. So to me, it's not a burden to be part of a society. You know what I mean? People are always thinking, like, why should I have to pay for someone else's well-being? Or why should I have to be part of this? And it's like, you're part of it too. Right. You know what I mean? Like, you're getting the benefits as well. Like, maybe you want to go live in the woods, but you're you're benefiting off of what this society is offering you. And so you should be a contributing member to making it a better place for everyone.
Sure. That's a good way to put it. That's great. I totally agree. I just think ideologically there's this movement of people who being like, there is no such thing as society. There are only individuals. And I just think like, look, that came from like the neoliberal and kind of Margaret Thatcher ideas that like society doesn't exist. And I think it's like, no, so society exists. It somehow fits into your economic vision and plans. But society is forced upon you. And because society exists, there are limits to, you going out and just privatizing and deregulating everything. And I think we're at this moment, very interesting in history, where we're sort of like fighting back against this belief that if you just give it to markets and corporations and there are a bunch of individuals, everything will work itself out. There's no society. Everything will just, magically meet.
Which is hilarious because then there's these externalities, which is an economic term that people use, that were not taken into account, such as fucking climate change. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, humans don't make errors. Just let them live in this market and everything will be fine. Just kidding. The world's on fire. Oops, did we make that mistake?
Right.
And I think it's actually hilarious to say there's no society because there is only society. Like, let's talk about this. The only reason we exist is because of society. The only reason I'm able to say words to you right now is because I'm part of a world that taught me how to communicate, which is a group of people coming together. Even the idea of the market is based on a set of values that humans shared with each other.
Absolutely.
There is no non-society. I just can't, it's so hard for me to conceptualize.
That.
We say the word culture and it merges into this thought.
You should have been there debating Margaret Thatcher in the UK in 1980.
Yes, exactly. I'm pissed. It just doesn't compute.
But see, that's where a criticism of the left is. Few people at that time were willing and able to make or even had that thought of how to tack her idea that society doesn't exist, right? Like, culturally, the left was unable to make a strong enough, compelling argument, and this I will criticize, I say whatever I want on the show, but American culture in the late 70s, okay? The president of the United States was Jimmy Carter, okay? And he had, since you brought up climate change, he had solar panels, okay, up in his roof. He asked Americans in a speech, okay, for them to sacrifice, not use as much electricity. This was during the oil embargoes and stuff like that. So he asked them, and I remember seeing this video of Jimmy Carter speaking to the American public and putting on a sweater, okay? Why was he doing that? Because he wanted to get Americans to sacrifice by not turning up the heat, okay, to save on imports from oil. It's basically that, okay? And he put up solar panels in the late 70s.
Yeah.
Okay, on the White House, okay? So that's the American culture, okay? At that time, they had a choice. It was Carter or Reagan, okay? And who did they elect? They elected, in many ways, culturally, the opposite of a guy asking them to sacrifice. They did.
That's powerful.
They did. It was powerful, but they did. They chose the guy who said, F all of that, okay? I'm going to bring back the oil prices are going to come down. I'm going to fix that. You're Americans. Your car should be bigger. We'll go spend more oil. F the world. Nobody tells us what to do.
Let's talk about that politically today. I mean, well not today, 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I know it didn't come down to Bernie versus Trump. It was actually Hillary versus Trump. But let's talk about Bernie versus Trump. Bernie was literally we need to be about society. Everyone deserves healthcare. Everyone deserves access to what they should have access to. And Trump was like, no. You guys deserve to enjoy life and let's make America great again. And so it's the exact same dichotomy.
It is.
And Americans chose comfort and wealth and prosperity. It's this idea of prosperity, but it's where does that come from? And
not surprisingly, FDR in that era where we had a lot more of that came from a society that had to sacrifice because of a world war. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that we had a lot more of government policies, yes, excluding certain racial groups, and there was internment camps, and there was a lot of the things, but there was certainly a stronger vibe about society that existed in the 30s and 40s. Mm-hmm. Okay,
about a collective
group of idea,
together.
But it was also racialized, right?
Yes.
So that there is that component about American society, and I think America and all societies that are heterogeneous struggle with that component. But you're absolutely right, and I think where we are right now is we've kind of reached this point where we could have chosen a sacrifice, but we don't. We choose comfort. And by the way, I want to just say this about car companies. I think it was Ford that has basically said we're going to get rid of our cars, our regular cars, and only produce SUVs and trucks and like one other car. And to me, that says it all, right? It's like the companies are looking at American trends, and what did they see? Consumers talking about their money, because they almost must hear this thing and think like we're a dictator, like this is the pure elites telling the masses how to live. The masses don't realize that the decisions they're making, like you said, are also being chosen by other people, right? It's not coming up just because, they think they're not being told what to do, but they are as well. Yeah. So you're seeing people buy up these large trucks, these large vans, and car companies are saying, why are we producing regular cars? And I mean, look at that decision. There's no sacrifice. You always have to be comfortable all the time. You want to talk about climate change? One of the largest contributors of climate change is air conditioning.
Wow.
I think it's number 2 of ACs.
Wow.
Okay. And I mean, again, but that goes back to comfort and sacrifice. And I get using AC, but does an AC need to be in every room all the time? Does it need to be on all the time? I mean, the way I grew up, I shut off the lights all the time when I exited a room.
Like, we didn't even have AC growing up. It was just fans and sweating it out. Like, what are you going to do?
I mean, I have not had an AC until this past year, where they finally put it in the apartment that I live in. But before that, no, it was fans. It was fans. Yeah. And so at nighttime, I just slept with a fan on. Yeah. And it makes it difficult. I can't deny at night. But you know what? I open the windows and it just works. But
it comes back to this question of like, why is it difficult? Like, what's wrong with difficulty? What is wrong with suffering in life a little bit? What is wrong with sacrifice? And so it comes back to this question of like, is it us as people? Like, what makes culture the way it is? Is it the people that are influencing our decisions using the internet, using marketing, using all of this consumer culture? Or is it us? Like, are we making these choices? You know what I mean? Or is it a little bit of both?
Well, I look at Europe. They're a capitalist society. I was going to say it's some part of American capitalism. But Europe, people invest in public transportation. People have high-speed rail. People were willing to make those investments and sacrifices, even if they're profit losing, even if they lose a little bit of money, right? Because they see there's a benefit to it. Fewer cars on the road, people active, not just sitting in their cars and driving everywhere. And so I to me, it's almost like there's something in American culture that I think is changing. And I think in many ways, a large part of why people ran to Trump is because they begun to see this cultural change in America. People don't often analyze Trump in that way, but I think in many ways Trump is it's a cultural call of the past to not lose this sort of internationalization of America, right? So I hear this a lot on people talking about not only politically correct culture, but that, Americans are weak today, the society is weak. You hear this from older folks, right? That like young people are weak or something like that, right? And they're not sacrificing, and they're becoming Europeanized, and they're traveling all the world, and they're foodies, and look, their gender is changing. They're no longer men, and women aren't women or something like that. And I think Trump, I don't know if he was purposely tapping into it, but his representation in politics is to go back to an era where America was first and we were on top and we got to do whatever we want without ever analyzing the consequences too, right? Of what you making these decisions. Right. But I'm sorry. Go ahead on any of that you thought. I mean, I just think it's a cultural populism. It's what it comes down to is cultural populism. Americans pay a huge price for it. And I don't think there's any way out of it without major sacrifices, because we're already starting to see the sacrifice. You know what it is? You know what's coming down to? Life expectancy declining 2 years in a row, which has never happened in American history, but we're already beginning to see that effect. And people are putting it on the opiate crisis. But you know what? It's opiate crisis, and it's other issues that Americans are having. And culturally, so I'm thinking big picture here, like the way global capitalism works, it is sort of forcing, maybe this is my optimism, it's forcing a change on American culture. Once you begin to expand this ability of people to travel, to communicate through cultures and different things, your culture is going to change very quickly, right? So now these French ideas that, French politicians were using for their public transport system, hey, maybe it'll work in America. I don't know. Maybe that's my positive thinking, but it tends to be happening in these sort of urbanized areas. And also, like, maybe people start watching French culture. I mean, for example, for me, I watch a lot of British soccer. Never thought in my life I cared about British playing soccer, but I love that stuff. And they're great at it, right? And then I get exposed to British culture. Culture is changing. It's always been changing, but I think there's an acceleration happening in this period right now.
No, there definitely is. I think also, sorry that I keep going back to climate change, but I think there's these pieces of, like you said, like global influences that are making us have to shift the way that we live. And culture has always, like you said, always been changing, and that'll be based on climate, based on war, based on access to resources. So we really are shifting, but it's really a question of like which direction and how and how long will it take? Because like you said, like even when Trump was elected, we started to shift back into this, like into the past.
Right.
And so it's kind of like a tug of war.
Right.
Interestingly.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we got to wrap up here because it's
good.
Closing. But any final thoughts? So tell me, what's your vision for agriculture, and what do you foresee happening in the future?
I think my vision is community food security. So I think just focusing in on communities, building capacity together with the needs of the people in that community being listened to and leading the cause. So like I said earlier, I don't think that the solution is one person shouting across the world like, hey, we all have to change. I think it's really looking inward to the people around you and investing in building support in your community.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel, for coming on Collateral Banter. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This was great.
Yeah, thanks.